Welcome, everyone. My name is Reverend Dr. Katie Gibbons-Keim, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Director of Religion and Civic Engagement at Odyssey Impact. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Lenape people who have stewarded the land for generations on which Odyssey Impact is located.
And I am Reverend Tawana Davis. I have the honor to co-moderate with Reverend Dr. Katie on today. I am the host of Healing the Healers, Domestic Violence, an awesome opportunity to lead in this 4-part series. I am also the co-founder of Soul to Soul Sisters, which is a faith-based racial justice organization. And I've had an opportunity to serve as a resident chaplain at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And I too want to respectfully acknowledge the Susquehannock, Nanticoke, and Piscataway people who stewarded the land where I am located here in Baltimore, Maryland.
So just a quick bit about Odyssey Impact. We are an interfaith media nonprofit which drives social change through innovative storytelling and media, connecting faith and secular communities. And we are the producers of the Golden Telly award-winning film series, Healing the Healers, which provides faith leaders and educators with conversations just like this today, really candid sharing between colleagues about how to respond to the most challenging spiritual care and justice crises.
And as domestic violence statistics rose during this pandemic year, and as 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence, statistics suggest that this crisis affects every faith community, which is why it's so important for us to do and come together in community in a faith-based approach to this, because it affects every faith community. And as faith leaders, we need to be prepared. Thus, the creation of this 4-part video series that accompanies written guides, Healing the Healers, Domestic Violence Media Resource also accompanies the 4-part video series as well, to give you as many tools as possible.
The media series itself and then this event today are all very much collaborative efforts, and we are really thrilled to uplift our partners for this town hall today: Genesis Shelter and Support, also the Crimes Against Women Conference, and the Institute for Community Coordinated Response.
And our Healing the Healers Domestic Violence Project partners, Faith Trust Institute, thank you. Peaceful Families Project, thank you. Connect, we thank you. Soul to Soul Sisters, we thank you. And we also are grateful to the Lilly Endowment for their generous support.
First, today, we have with us an esteemed group of faith leaders and advocates who all have extensive experience in really different ways working to respond to domestic violence in their communities. We're so grateful for their wisdom and their partnership and their presence in this discussion today. So with that, panelists, would you mind briefly saying hello?
Good afternoon. Salam alaikum. My name is Dr. Denise Zia Berthe. I am speaking to you and very honored to speak to you from the land of the Lenape, who were, I also want to acknowledge, exterminated and relocated forcibly from their land, which is part of the systemic history of violence in the area otherwise known as Philadelphia. I also want to recognize that as an exilee myself, everywhere that I am is also the land of Palestine. So I am also currently the executive director of the Peaceful Families Project, who is a partner in this and is very excited to be part of Odyssey and this particular town hall meeting to talk about domestic violence.
Greetings. My name is Reverend Kerry James Jr., pronouns he and him. I'm the senior pastor of Jones Church in Washington, D.C. I respectfully acknowledge the Anacostan people who have stewarded for generations the land on which Jones Church is located in Washington, D.C.
Hi, my name is Jan Langbein. My pronouns, I recognize she, her, and from Texas, y'all. I'm the CEO of Genesis Women's Shelter and Support in Dallas, Texas. The North Central region, including Dallas, the Fort Worth area, was a mixed buffer zone that no one tribe ever claimed. However, I respectfully acknowledge the Wichita, Tawakoni, Humanos, Kickapoo people who regularly camped in and passed through this area.
Thank you all. And also I'll just note that Carrie was a featured speaker within episode 4 of our series. So there's so many ways that everybody here has participated in the project. So just a few other things to sort of lay the foundation for our viewing and our conversation today. You know, so many of us watching identify in some way as care professionals, and as care professionals, we're deeply invested in, and we even get energized by these conversations on matters of care and justice. But it can be so easy to forget the emotional cost of engaging these difficult topics together. So just with that in mind, and naming that the topic of domestic violence can be challenging and can bring up in us, even those of us seasoned in this work, can bring up all sorts of unexpected feelings. We just remind you to really take care of yourself, to disconnect when you need to, and know that you are in charge of how you view today. So, and also just to sort of get us in our bodies, I invite us all to just take some deep breaths. I know I always need it. In through nose. And out. As you take some deep breaths, just remember, feel the ground beneath your feet. Feel the chair or whatever you're sitting on, feel it beneath you. Feel the way in which you're held. And take a moment, we invite you to just consider your intention right now and your connectedness. Remember your connectedness to your own body, to your physical surroundings, and however you might experience greater purpose and love. We also want to say very clearly, if you are in danger, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and we'll speak it as well as put it in the chat, 800-799-7233, 800-799-SAFE. It is open 24 hours. And again, we're posting that in the chat.
Ashe. The video clips that we are showing today will be from the Healing the Healers Domestic Violence film series. There are no dramatic reenactments. We do this intentionally, centering storytelling, not further traumatizing or bringing up further incidences that may really hit close to home. So we do it through storytelling to invite us into a sacred space of learning and engaging and dialoguing. Since there are no dramatic reenactments, you will hear colleagues talking about their experiences and sharing thoughts with each other about this very difficult topic. We are honored to share this project trailer on today. So panelists, let's turn off our videos as we watch the first trailer. It was in seminary when I realized that I was in a domestic violence relationship. My professor was talking about domestic violence and I sat there in shock. That's me. Deciding to leave was an end and a beginning. I've made it my mission to talk about my story, to find other faith leaders. What could I learn from them? How do we encourage more faith leaders to boldly speak and lead us through this crisis?
We all lived in silence about the trauma that was taking place in our household.
The most basic pastoral care things, I believe, are the most powerful in these situations.
Many women in the church told me that we need a male's voice. We need you to speak up.
Especially as women, we run to the church.
Sacred spaces are safe spaces.
I had to redefine forgiveness.
To ask people to forgive prematurely. That is really spiritual abuse.
And we even use the sacred text to support that twisted thinking.
What can we do to help you? That is how you talk to people.
We have these wonderful tools before us. Jenny, why aren't we using them?
The faith community has so much to offer.
We're working together to save one life at a time.
We're not victims, we're victors.
With 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experiencing violence from an intimate partner, this is happening in every single faith community. It is a crisis. When someone comes to you, will you know what to do to save that person's life? All right, if we can come on back into this sacred space. Yes, so our question is, as faith leaders, as leaders in the community, as first responders, will you know what to do if someone comes to you who is in a domestic violence relationship? And will you know what to do to use the tools to save someone's life? So today, we will hear from each of our panelists that come from varying backgrounds and leadership experience in building these safe and sacred and supportive communities for victims and survivors. This is not easy work. Let's just pause and take a deep breath on that. This is not easy work, but it's crucial work. It is divine work. It is much needed work in our communities. So I turn to our esteemed panelists and ask, can each of you talk about the work you have done in building strong communities of support for victims and survivors, and why faith leaders are key to your work? And we'll start with Dr. Denise.
Thank you so much. I think for me, it has been a sort of incredible journey as both a psychologist, a community activist and organizer, and now as the director of the Peaceful Families Project. I am by trade a clinical psychologist. And when I started my field work, because I grew up in a situation where there was domestic violence, that was the one thing I didn't want to do. And of course, Allah in his infinite wisdom has always put me right back into that circle, working with victims and children who have had the same experiences that I had. So as a clinician, really, a lot of my work has been about acknowledging, allowing women to talk and find safe and sacred places through both their own searches and then within the community and the faith communities that they were in. So using really the ideas of liberation theology, using the ideals of community in terms of healing. As Peaceful Families Project, we are able to work a little bit more closely with faith leaders themselves. So the work of Peaceful Families is in fact as its mission to educate both communities, but religious leaders, but faith leaders within the Muslim community, how to use our sacred texts really to give us a map of what positive family functioning looks like, and to remind folks that that does not include, and certainly not in our faith tradition, never included violence, never included humiliation, never included oppression. In fact, the opposite, Islam was built on the idea of protecting vulnerable communities. And the initial work of Islam was about giving equity to women in every area of life, but certainly in terms of within the home and protection within the home. So all of the work that we do has to do with working with faith leaders, training. We also do work in research because we know that faith traditions have been taken out of research in some ways. So the voices we hear, the knowledge that we have, the idea of best practice has almost been to take to take faith out of it, that that's not scientific, that that's not secular enough. And what we know within our community, as within all faith communities, that this is where victims go, and this is how they structure healing, so that we cannot have best practice in the field of domestic violence without including really a deep understanding of what the sacred texts say, how that faith leaders work with victims into survivors, how they manage what wisdom that they give within their communities for domestic violence. Aside from that, of course, I work internationally, so Latin America, West Africa, and the Middle East, Palestine in specific, to know that this is not a small problem. This is a global issue, and that it touches women in the areas, well, of victims in the area of human rights, in the area of trafficking, in the area of general oppression, that you cannot address one of these things without addressing all of them.
For me, I'm a childhood survivor of domestic violence. As far back as I can remember, I saw my father abuse my mother. My father was a police officer, and a lot of things that he dealt with on the job, he brought home, unfortunately, to my mother and to me. And so growing up in that home, I saw firsthand what abuse does to me, and of course to my mother. And so that helped me in this sense to find out how that trauma affected me and do that internal work for that generational trauma that is very heavy in my family, and to be able to help others through that process. As a little boy, I heard people in the church, in the faith community, tell my mother, God hates divorce. Leaving is not an option. You're supposed to be subject and submit to your husband, no matter what he does to you. And so as a child, I said, that can't be true. That can't be correct. But in that particular faith community and in the larger community as a whole, those were the recommendations that they gave my mother, to just stay there. You must not be praying hard enough. You must be doing something wrong. She was the problem. She was the reason she was receiving that. And so with all of those twisted scriptures from the sacred text, I knew better that there had to be a better way. There had to be an option. God did not call any woman or child or family to be subject to domestic abuse. And so I learned that domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, is all about power and control. And my father had control as a police officer, and when he came home, he wanted to have that same power and control. And so he dominated me, he dominated my mother, as if he was still on the job as an officer. And so what I've done working through that journey of healing is I've served in various jurisdictions as a police chaplain, Baltimore Police Department, Anne Arundel County Police Department. And I saw firsthand what happens to officers. I saw what happens in the faith community, that there was a disconnect between law enforcement and the faith community. And so I put myself in the situation as a chaplain to be the bridge between the faith community, the community, and law enforcement. So we were able to help bridge that gap, talk to the community about law enforcement, talk to the community about safety plans, talk to the community about resources that will assist them in their endeavor so that they can escape domestic violence. As a pastor, what I've done is I've implemented a zero tolerance policy. Domestic violence will not be tolerated in any church I serve. And we post that in the restrooms. We post that all around social media in the building to let anyone who would be an abuser know that we will not tolerate that. We place information in the restrooms with telephone numbers and other services that anyone that is experiencing domestic violence can get the resources that they need. Also serve on the board of directors of Seeds of Security, which is ministry in the Baltimore, Washington Conference of the United Methodist Church, where we provide resources for anyone who calls us who needs a place to stay, who needs funds to get out of a domestic abuse situation. And when we've been able to help various families escape the pain and the suffering and the abuse that they're enduring in domestic abuse. And so again, the other thing that I tend to do is to make sure that we work together as a team, collaborate, form partnerships with advocates, with providers, with law enforcement, and all of those people so that we can work together to make sure that everyone in our community knows how we all should respond to domestic violence.
Thank you, Reverend James. I come from a very different background. I did not grow up in abuse, and to be real honest, I never really thought about it. As I look back over my 30-year career, my mother died very young of breast cancer, and I wonder why I'm not putting on that pink visor and running for the cure of that. But I started out at Genesis Women's Shelter and Support in Dallas as the Tuesday morning volunteer. I had no idea that the women there would look like me or their children would look like mine. And to be real honest, I was offended. I found that domestic victims, survivors of domestic violence are tall and short and fat and thin and Black and white and Hispanic. And the only common thread that I could find among all victims of domestic violence is that they were in a relationship with an abusive partner. My journey is no less with the hand of God than you're both, the both of you and your journey here. Somehow the board of directors recognized this fire in my belly and hired me to be the leadership when they needed a new leadership at Genesis. And so I went down there, my briefcase full of naivete, and I realized that I had no strategic plan. I'd never hired, I'd never fired. I hadn't read a financial statement. It didn't take long, however, before I realized that Black numbers were good and red numbers were really bad. But I just put one foot in front of the other and said, well, how can she possibly get a job if she doesn't have childcare? So we put childcare on site. How could she possibly not go out and work if her children are not safe in the school where they're enrolled? And so we put school on site. How could she possibly be safe if, in fact, she doesn't have access to civil legal representation? And so we put a legal clinic on site. Now, I know that sounds really easy. And in fact, a couple of my board members are on here and they know the trials and tribulations we had along the way. But it took 30 years to be able to get there. Now, with regards to our partnerships, let me back up. In addition to our shelter, when we added those different programs, we added transitional housing because a 6 to 8 week stay in a shelter is not long enough. We also know that only a small portion of the battered population will ever seek shelter. And so we opened our non-residential office for those women who either haven't left, haven't gotten out, or have other residential resources, but still need those same advocacy, therapy, trauma-informed response, access to civil legal representation. And so we have become this continuum of care that no matter where a survivor falls into our services, we stand ready with the best cutting-edge clinical responses, the best opportunity for having someone walk beside her in her journey. So like I say, I don't know why the board of directors hired me, but they did. And the smartest thing I ever did was hire the smartest people I could find. And what we've created there is pretty incredible at Genesis. We also provide the nation's leading training on crimes against women. Every single year, we put on training for law enforcement, advocates, prosecutors, judges, forensic nurses, in order for them to know how to respond when that survivor falls into their sphere of influence. So what we know most definitely is that I'll never be able to shelter enough people if there are no police officers making an arrest. And it doesn't matter how many police officers make an arrest if, in fact, the prosecutors don't prosecute or the judges have no finding of domestic violence. I know by living this work for the last 30 years that none of us can do this alone. And so we look at the medical community, we look at the law enforcement community, but the faith community is probably one of the most critical areas that could make a difference in this. And I grew up, and Pastor, I grew up as a Methodist preacher's daughter. And I can tell you, I never heard a sermon, not as a child or an adult, about the issue of domestic violence. And when I started at Genesis, I did go to my senior pastor and said, "You've never preached on the issue of domestic violence." You could see the sweat break out on his upper lip. Like, oh my gosh, what am I going to have to say? What am I going to have to do? And I'm like, well, do it, whatever you think you need to do. You have to stand up. You have to say something. You have to be part of the solution. You have to be able to recognize the symptoms and know the cure. And so I think the faith communities are one of our most significant partners in this work. Not coming from abuse, sometimes I feel like I don't understand all of it, but that doesn't mean I don't care. And I think that's what survivors want to know, that you care and that you're brave enough to say, I'm scared for you, that you're brave enough to call your elected official and say, what in the world were you thinking when you passed that open carry law in Texas? What were you thinking that you have not passed? You have not reinstated the Violence Against Women Act when so many programs are counting on that. I think that's what we need to do, is have the courage to make a difference, however you can, with whatever you have. And I forgot the question, actually. What was the question?
You covered it.
I covered it. Okay, whatever it was, I covered it. All right.
Beautifully. Yes.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I hear a common thread, Tawana, I don't know about you, but I'm hearing a common thread of how important it is that faith leaders are involved. And what exactly do we, I mean, I know I have learned a ton in just coming alongside the Healing the Healers 2 project, as with my own experience as a parish pastor. I look back and wonder about moments I would have done differently, but I think about like what I would like to tell if I have like 5 minutes with a fellow pastor. What do you all think? Like, if you have 5 minutes with a faith leader of any kind, what are the things you most want them to know about this topic?
I think for me, one is, and this is true for faith leaders, but also for first responders, which is what trauma looks like and feels like and what it does to people, why they can't answer, you know, that fight, flee or friend, the fact that your frontal lobe does not work, the fact that you cannot put sentences together, the fact that you're not going to remember anything that anybody says to you, so that if you're going to give advice that you write it down, that you meet with them several times, all of those kinds of things. And also the triggering for faith leaders who many times are not trained in this, and even for first responders. So when you talk about your dad coming home and bringing that home, part of that is also the lack of training and support for first responders around their own traumas and working through what trauma-informed care and knowledge really looks like. So when I think about of all the myriad of things that I want to say to people, I think one of that is the first, because it's so easy to misunderstand somebody who doesn't answer, or who shuts down, or who calls you 6 times with the same question. All of those things that have to do with what the biophysiological experience of trauma does to people in that moment, and why we need that training, even to enter into that conversation with people.
Lisa, I agree with you 100%. And what I'll add to that is, and I see in the chat, a few people, Diane and others, are making the comment that this is a dirty secret in faith communities, that we don't talk about it. We don't preach about it. We don't teach about it. And Jan, you mentioned that, you know, with a little force, you encourage the pastor to preach a sermon and so forth. And so what I would say to faith leaders is, you don't have to be an expert to make a difference. We don't want you to be an expert. But you have a voice, you have parishioners, you have a congregation. And so in that voice that you have, lift up your voice and let it ring, and share information. Bring in the experts to talk about what it looks like. Bring in the experts to talk about the cycle of abuse. Bring in the experts and medical professionals and law enforcement to really help your congregation understand it. The other thread I saw in the chat was people were mentioning, like me, they were told those twisted scriptures from the sacred text as well. And so again, I would tell a faith leader is to make sure that if you're going to interpret scripture, make sure that you use the correct hermeneutic, or make sure that you correctly interpret scripture, because you can do more damage by standing on some of the misogynistic understandings and interpretations of scripture. You can do so much harm and damage to people. I had a parishioner come up to me, and her husband were involved in the life of our congregation. They were, big givers. They worked for the federal government, had been there for years, almost in retirement. And her husband was having an affair with another woman in the congregation. And people were aware about it. And so whenever she would bring it up, she would be abused and so forth. And even in the church, she would be abused and yelled at and things of that nature. And so she talked to a few other people, and they told her those twisted scriptures. God hates divorce. If you get a divorce, you're going to hell. You have to stay with him. This is your cross to bear. And so she mustered up enough strength and energy, and I reached out to her, but she didn't return my calls. As you mentioned, Denise, that frontal lobe is not working. But she eventually, after several calls to her, she responded, and she said, I was so ashamed. I was so embarrassed. I don't want my eternal salvation to be at risk. So if I have to endure this, I'll stay in this abusive relationship because I do want to go to heaven. I do want to have eternal life. And I shared with her this brief analogy, and I'll be done. I told her that God was more important about the people inside of a burning house than God is about the house that's on fire. And what I mean by that is she was in a marriage that really wasn't a marriage. It was an abusive marriage. She was being punched and kicked and verbally, sexually, mentally abused. And so therefore, God isn't concerned about that, because that is not a marriage. So God wants to rescue you out of that burning house so that you can have a new life, a new beginning elsewhere without the abuser. And when I told her that, it was like the light bulb went off, Denise, in her eyes and in her brain and in her head. And she said, you mean I can leave? And I said, yes, pack your bags. We have a place that you can go, and I'll help you. And that changed her life. And she's doing so much better now. She has her own home, and she is just so relieved. But she felt the pressure and the burden of losing her eternal salvation, because that's what people were telling her. And so I would definitely talk to a faith leader and tell them the importance of using their voice to make a difference, and the importance of correctly interpreting the sacred text.
Reverend James, I think you are very unique. If you ever move to Dallas, let me know, because you're pretty amazing. We do not find that kind of enlightenment. We hear women of all faith communities, all faith walks, come into Genesis and say, I divorced this man. I left this man after 15 years. And when I did, I was no longer welcome at my communion table. And when I was no longer welcome at my communion table, I was no longer welcome at my mama's dinner table. So yes, that's exactly right. Someone wrote in, and I think it was Diane, but somebody wrote in and they were talking about, so who are these abusers? They too come from all walks of life. They too come from every socioeconomic, every business. They are doctors, they are lawyers, they are pastors, they are unemployed, they are from all walks of life. But again, the common threads are power and control over someone else. This is a choice to do. This wasn't because I had a hard day at the office. A lot of us have a hard day at the office. It wasn't because I don't have enough money, because a lot of us don't have enough money. But if you as pastors can think, and Dr. Oliphant, I'm so glad that you're on this call today from Dallas, but if you pastors can think in terms of what that abuser has told her, he's told her, nobody will hear you, nobody will believe you, and nobody will help you. So I'm not asking you to be an expert. I'm not asking, well, I am asking that we should teach this in seminary. But if you think nobody will hear you, nobody will believe you, and nobody will help you, when you show her, I believe you, And how do you do that? How do you say, I believe you? Now you can say it, but then you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so surprised. He's such a great guy. He sings in the choir. Well, forget it. You've just undone everything you tried to do. I think if you can show that you believe her and that you hear her and that you will help her, what does that look like? So those are just the three things. I will help you find a safe place. I will help you get in touch with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE. I will help you get, through to Genesis Women's Shelter. I will walk beside you. That's another thing that I would really like to throw in here. Dr. Katie, I don't know that this is the most appropriate time to do it, but when all of us started out as it is important, actually appropriate. When all of us started out in this work, we used what was called a medical model. A medical model is, someone would come to us and say, I can't sleep, I can't eat, and I cry all the time. Through a medical model, much like the medical profession, I would say, well, let me give you this pill. I'm going to get you a job. I'm going to get you a protective order, and then you'll be fine. But over the years, we have become much more educated and enlightened, and said, instead of a medical model of trying to fix somebody, we know that we don't say what's wrong with you anymore. Through a trauma-informed approach, we say what's happened to you, and we begin to walk beside her. So that's another thing pastors should hear, not just, gosh, I'm so surprised, or how did you let this happen, or here, I can fix this. They just want someone to believe them and someone to walk beside them, not quote a bunch of scripture, those three things is what I would tell any pastor who is wanting to begin in a ministry of healing for victims of domestic violence.
This is a space of permission where it's okay to say, I don't know what I don't know. And this is what we do. This is why we're coming together to provide these tools and to have this dialogue, because no two story is exactly scripted alike. So it is okay with humility and vulnerability as a faith leader, as a pastor, as a first responder, to say, I don't know what I don't know. Because once we acknowledge that, we open up this curiosity, we open up this appreciative inquiry versus operating out of deficit and judgment. We now open up to walking with. A few of you talked about walking with and journeying with and sharing these tools. And it takes humility and vulnerability and a sense of unconditional positive regard for that victim and or survivor, or even the perpetrator, because we do have to deal with this from all angles in order to address domestic violence. So Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
And we can all tell, right? Like there is so much complexity here. There's so many subtopics here. We could never possibly contain in this 75-minute event all there is to cover. And so the great news is that we have created resources for exactly this purpose and aimed exactly at faith leaders of a variety of traditions to really go deep and have tools to talk together and just have tools about how to think through one's own context, how to build tool sets, how to just figure out what you need. Faith leaders so often are asked to be experts in all the things, right? That's one of the biggest challenges is being recognized across traditions about just this having to be an expert in everything. But we want to say loud and clear that a really big theme we hope is a takeaway from this event is that you are not alone in figuring this out, that some of your best tools will be calling the DV advocate in your area, or if nothing else, if you remember nothing else, this is my personal thing I think is so valuable from a faith perspective, call the DV hotline. If you're like, I don't even know, this is confidential, I just need somebody to talk this through, am I making a bigger mess by saying something, what's my situation? Calling someone who's an expert in that is hugely helpful and important. All right, so that said, just also want to name we are offering just two really practical free resources, the Spiritual Community Declaration, and then also 10 things the faith community can do from our partners at Faith Trust Institute, to whom we are so grateful. These are free resources on our website that can get you started, and those are in the chat. And Tawana, I hand it back to you.
All right, so we are about to experience the next clip. In this clip, 2 minutes from episode 3, From Harmful to Helpful, Religion and Masculinity. I had the opportunity to discuss spiritual abuse, forgiveness, and supporting survivors with Imam Muhammad Majid, who is Executive Imam at Adams Center, All Dulles Area Muslim Society, and an advisory board member and trainer at Peaceful Families. So let's share the clip from episode 3.
When we talk about healing, one of the things that I want to make sure me as a clergy don't do is to ask people to forgive prematurely. That is really spiritual abuse. Why this man not asking her for forgiveness? Why not the abuser asking for forgiveness? I said, healing is not a switch, turn on and off. Forgiveness is not a switch, you turn on and off.
Here I am a good 10 years out of my relationship, and I still find those areas where I need to check back with self and still do the work necessary to remain in a mode of healing. When I left, it was the ending of one thing, but it was also the beginning of another, a beginning of a new life, of healing and transformation. Another piece to that, though, is the forgiveness piece. We have gone through so much in society and as a community, and the first thing people want to default to is forgiveness.
There's a process of forgiveness. That survivor has to always to feel being empowered by the community, by people around them, and encourage them to always to own their own narrative, not to have anyone to impose a narrative on them. Let them talk about their own story the way they choose to talk. Just follow their lead. Encourage them to say, we're here to help you, whatever you want to do. We can tell you that we can offer you, but we want you to go to this journey knowing that you have enough support around you and love around you to be able to say, I'm going to stand on my feet. I'm going to not allow this memory or the history of abuse to shackle me. I have to use it as a positive experience of courage.
Positive experience of courage. Yeah, there's so much there. And I just want to share also, just picking up a thread from our conversation before. As we've rolled out this project, we've had so many conversations with chaplains, with faith leaders across traditions, across disciplines, across contexts, folks who work in hospitals, all sorts of contexts. But we've had one in-person event that was especially fascinating in that it brought together law enforcement, clergy, and domestic violence advocates. And some of that same kind of conversation we're having here, but it was local. It was in rural Florida. And they had the sheriff was there, a police officer was there. The police officer had been a pastor before he was a police officer, and identified as someone who was a childhood victim of domestic violence himself. And he said, the moment I watched all the faith leaders in the room, their spines get straight and they lean forward, was when he said, look, here's how this is going to go. When you confront this in your community, when you sense that something is not okay and something needs to be said or done, whatever the situation is, or when it's been revealed and steps are being taken, just wait. There'll be the guy, if this is talking from a male perspective, the guy who sidles up to you at coffee hour and says, you know what, Pastor, can we just deal with this a different way? You know, like let's not be breaking up marriages and things. And it's the complexities facing faith leaders when these things open up in faith communities can be enormous. And it's so important that we know we're not alone. So in thinking about this clip and in thinking about the situations that are real and that are complicated for faith leaders, what are some of the things y'all think about in terms of like how it really works and what faith leaders need to know? Or yeah, I tend to like ask 4 questions at once, so I'll stop there.
I think for us, one of the things that we do, and it is part of Peaceful Families curriculum, is this idea of how we as a faith community are called to address oppression. And the beautiful thing in the Quran is we are told that our job is to, within believers, so we're assuming that everyone is within our, within our bubble, that our job is to educate oppressors of what they are doing. So our first job is to say, hey, this looks like oppression to me. This looks like an oppression at every level, from the household to the, to the national government. And that is our sacred obligation as believers one to another. So part of our job is how do we get then the courage to do that? Going back to, again, not moving away from our faith, but moving more closely into our faith and saying, this is really part of who we are as believers and our job as believers. One of the things that we're doing, however, is moving into that complexity and also moving out of it, which is to say, we know that domestic violence does not start with that one person when they are an adult, that these are messages that folks are hearing from the time that they're little guys. So one of the things that we're doing, and the other thing is, we know that we cannot just work with women, we cannot just work with victims, that we need to address this as a full community, and it needs to be something that we talk about all the time. So one of the things that we're doing at Peaceful Families, and that we work with our male allies, that we actually have a Peaceful Partners Pledge, that we have people go online and say, we know maybe this isn't about you, but you're listening, your eyes and your ears. And if we have 100, 1,000 Muslim men saying, this is not part of my religion, this is not part of being a Muslim male, that is a really strong message to send to all those little boys who are growing up and saying, well, I see, no, we can't see, that we need to work with the full community to be able to have the courage to talk about this even before it happens, even before we're in that complex situation, in terms of prevention, in terms of giving messages from the beginning, the jokes about being henpecked, all of those, none of those things can be, as you said, zero tolerance. So none of those things being tolerated, but also giving men a positive place where they can be leaders and they can speak and they can talk. This is not my, not my need as a male. This is not how I lead. And this is not how I run my family. So all of those things I think are important. The other thing is, I do think in terms of the complexities and the difficult situations that faith leaders are called to manage, is to really, again, open up the doors to them of support. You are not, nobody has an answer to this, right? So we have to involve justice system people, we have to involve mental health people, we have to involve our parishioners, and they need to hear it enough every day. And we are so lucky to have Imam Majid is part of my board, so you can imagine my joy. His congregation, like, it is known, like, it is not, you do not mention this without knowing what his stand is on that. And that is that sort of preemptive courage to be bringing it up even before it happens. And then certainly having no equivocation, having no confusion when it comes up. And again, for us, we go back to our sacred text, which is very clear, you do not do all of these things. You do not oppress in your house. You do not use humiliating language. You do not, even in war, do you take away people's access to human rights. So I think all of those things, and then offering the support, which is so many of our faith leaders are so tired and they are overwhelmed, to really offer them that whole team behind them to be able to address these issues.
Thanks for sharing that, Denise. I totally agree with all of those points. And one thing I'll add to that is for faith leaders to be aware of spiritual abuse and the role that faith leaders have in their faith community, as well as the larger community, is, that of respect. Faith leaders are respected. And so therefore you have influence in this particular issue and many issues. And so use that influence that you have, use your voice to make a difference. And so some of those things that are indicators of spiritual abuse is when someone uses beliefs to manipulate someone else. And we see that all the time. I saw that as a little boy, and something inside of me clicked and said, that isn't right. They are using beliefs to manipulate your mother to say that, and she doesn't have faith because she's trying to get out of this abusive marriage. Also, if someone prevents their partner from practicing their religious faith, that is a sign of spiritual abuse as well. And then forcing someone to violate their religious abuse or practices is a form of, spiritual abuse. Forcing children to be reared in a faith that has not been agreed to by the parents is another sign of spiritual abuse. And we've said so much about this one, I won't say much. Misusing the sacred text to justify abuse, dominating, and oppressive behavior. And so again, we have to make sure that we don't let anyone, and we're not victims as faith leaders of misusing those scriptures to make sure that we endorse people being dominated and oppressed by their spouse. And there are many others, but the main thing is to make sure that no one denies the value of someone else. All of us can agree that all of us are made in God's image. God goes by many names, but all of us are made in God's image. And so as a faith leader, make sure that people love each other and serve each other, because all of us are God's creation. And so again, as a faith leader, you can do that, and you don't have to be the expert. Partner with the various people in your community. One thing that I do, and I'm serving a new appointment now, I've been appointed to a new congregation. I've met with the police department. I've met with mental health providers. I've met with judges. I've met with advocates. I've met with various groups, even during a pandemic, to introduce myself to them and to get to know them and know where resources are and where I can make referrals to people in my congregation who experience domestic or intimate partner violence. And one of the people told me, I wish more faith leaders were like you, because the only time I see them, if I ever see them, is during a crisis. And you're getting ahead of it. So when we meet again, then it's not the first time, and that's not the time for an introduction, but that's the time to get reacquainted. And so I'm so glad that you're reaching out to us and you're partnering with us to have us in your safety net and in our plan. And so in our network, I reach out to them to make sure that I know where the resources are in our community. And I would advise other faith leaders to do the same. Find out, visit, call the hospital, call the judge who does peace orders and protective orders. Find out what that process is. In many jurisdictions, they can be done 24 hours a day at no cost. And a lot of faith leaders don't even know that. And so just, again, build your network. You're not an expert. I'm not an expert, but we can work together to bring about a safer community. And we can strengthen the response to domestic violence in our faith communities and our broader communities as well.
Yep. That's so well said. And I want to lift up two comments from the chat. What you've named here, Reverend Carey, is some concrete things that you can do. And other things, looks like Dr. Kathy Tatum said, I've rescued 3 ladies in this pandemic, and they would never have been able to leave for church, moving to virtual, gave them chance to leave without judgment. And then looks like Clayton Oliphant shared, pastors, we interviewed domestic violence experts in October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, in a worship service. And then within 2 weeks, 3 women sought help. It can be that momentous to bring the subject publicly, to have it come out of a faith leader's mouth that this matters and this happens. And then it can look like all kinds of things, not just bruises. Abuse takes all kinds of forms. Also want to uplift that the series itself goes more deeply into spiritual abuse and how sacred text can be used for harm. And we've created this for denominational structures, for conferences, for clergy groups, and it's to occasion these conversations. We also just want to get to, Denise, if you could just share a bit before we go to the next clip, you've named several times just sort of like how going to the law enforcement system is not the same for everyone.
Okay. So one of the things that we have not uniquely, but more so in Muslim communities than in others, because according to the Pew Foundation, Muslims are the most diverse linguistically, culturally, immigration-wise than any other of the faith traditions, is this idea of what we call, police Russian roulette, right? So if we don't have those, and we're in national organizations, so we don't know the police in each of the areas where our folks are going. And I do think we have to be knowledgeable and also acknowledge the fact that we do not have one justice system in this country. So when we're talking about differently documented immigrants, which can go from no permission to legal permanent residence, but not citizenship, there is a different justice system. There just is. So we need to use that resource of the justice system carefully, because we have people who are getting joint orders and then their immigration status is nullified. We've had judges, when women go in for protective orders, call ICE directly and have people picked up from their courtrooms. We have men who were, and in all good faith, I at some point was running a group for domestic violence perpetrators. And if they looked immigrant, it wasn't even they all had the same status. If they looked immigrant, they were going into the PO. They were coming to services. They were going to their POs, and they were taken away to ICE and deported in the midst of trying to get better. So I think we do need to recognize that there is a real fear and there is a real difference in the way that people are treated. We need to look at linguistics. We need to make sure that people can be understood. Because again, when your frontal lobe is turned off, even if you're bilingual, there are days that I speak 4 languages. There are days I can speak no languages. There are days that I can, hours of the day when I get stuck in one. People need to have that linguistic access. We need to have culture, race, and we also, for us as Muslims especially, there is Islamophobia, which interferes with. I had a police officer tell me, well, I couldn't arrest him. He was Muslim and that's part of your religion. So he was being culturally appropriate by not arresting a domestic violence perpetrator. Thank you very much. So we need to know that all of these things need to be representative in training, in actuality. And we also need to understand when people choose not to report. We can't have one cookie cutter answer, right? That the answer is always call the police, get an order of protection, go to shelter, because that is not going to be the answer to everyone. So we need to open up, which is why we're so interested in doing research as well. We need to open up best practice. We need to look at all of the different options that are open, given the person's particular not only situation, but knowledge. We also know that when women leave, the likelihood that they will be killed is 2 to 3 times higher. It's not when they're there. When they're there, to be honest, as horrific as it is, it's statistically safer. So when we ask women to take, or we ask victims to take those very scary steps, we also need to listen to them and their expertise around what's appropriate for their community, for their family, for their safety, what they know about this perpetrator that we don't know.
Denise, I absolutely agree with you. I love your phrase when you said Russian roulette. It's like the luck of the draw, as we might say here in Texas, on what the police response would be. But I would love to just please put out to all of you all, don't give up. Don't give up. This is, we looked at this last year of terrible things that this nation kind of took a temperature, an inventory on, the relationships and the cultural experiences and the histories with law enforcement. But they're partners we can't do without. We have worked very, very hard to put laws in place. I firmly believe that without accountability, perpetrators are, whatever that accountability looks like, whether it's from the faith community or their next door neighbor or their boss, or the law enforcement community. Without that, it's just a green light to go forth and hurt some more. So a lot of us have, as I say, burned a lot of lingerie at our state and our federal capitals over the years of trying to make this better. So don't give up on it is what I might throw in there. It can be better, but it is through training. It is through an understanding. It is through weeding out those who are not the appropriate responders. So anyway.
For that. And if I can add, Jan and Denise, you are definitely tapping into my personal story as I learned of being a domestic violence victim in seminary. And in seminary, I received the order of protection, but my husband at the time just always knew to fly under that radar, right? So if it said to be 500 feet away, he was 600 feet away, or, you know, not to contact close friends and families, he would just stalk the campus. So doing things to fly under the radar. And then when I did go to court, I was further victimized by court officers through judgment. The judge, my husband at the time, my abuser, was steady talking to me after the judge gave us both directions not to talk to each other, but to talk with the judge. So I'm sitting there like, am I being punked? Is this really happening to me, where I'm being further victimized by the system? And then as we were leaving the court, the two court clerks were talking to my spiritual mother and said, you know, well, he seems to love her so much and he seems so nice. And why is she doing this to him? And I'm walking ahead of them, listening to all of this. So although we have these wonderful things in place, so many stories look so different and they're so complex, but we must trust our communities and trust in the God that we serve, because the system, if we trust in the system, it's not perfect, but we have to go for it. We got to do something. I think earlier in conversation, do something about it, because if I stay in this situation, the likelihood of me surviving is slim to none. And then if I follow the tools and the safety plans, the likelihood of me surviving increases. It's still a risk. It's still a risk for all, but even the system let me down at the time. Even my neighbors, because I was staying on campus, even here in the apartment where I live, I heard a disruption going on between an adult and a child, and I didn't know what to do. I'm a domestic violence survivor and an advocate. And I was like, well, do I call the police and have, you know, someone arrested, or to have the child taken out of the home? Do I sit and listen? And she said she was going to throw him out the house. So I went outside to look to see if he was around, and he wasn't. And then things calmed down. But I couldn't believe it as a faith leader, as a domestic violence survivor. In that moment, I froze, and I didn't know what to do in that moment. So again, this moment, giving permission to say, you know, there are times when I don't know, and I do need to reach out to resources and advocates in those communities and that team that we need to propel us forward into healthy and sacred spaces. So thank you for leading that and positing that into this conversation. Appreciate it.
Can I add something briefly? And so in the African-American community, we're on edge due to a lot of police brutality. And that's another layer in domestic violence. As it was said before, roulette or whatever term, luck of the draw, whatever term you want to use, sometimes we don't know what type of officer we're going to get. And so therefore, it is a domestic abuse situation, which is wrong, but that can escalate to people being dead at the hands of a police officer. So a lot of people in the African-American community are asking the question, do I suffer in silence and endure? At least I'll live. But if I call the wrong police officer to this situation, or someone calls on my behalf, then now that person has to live with the guilt that I called just for you to go and do something about the domestic abuse situation, but you went in with guns drawn and you shot everybody in the house. So that's a real reality that we have to look at. And for example, in Baltimore City, they're below 700 officers, sworn officers, for a city the size of Baltimore. And so what that means is calls are prioritized. And we know the system doesn't work. And so in a lot of people's thinking, a domestic call is usually going to end with the couple staying together. So that's not a high priority call for me to answer. I'm going to go to a violent or a more violent situation where I can make an arrest, because I can't necessarily do that in that particular situation. And so again, those are some of the ways that the system is flawed. And then I also hear so often, especially for our African-American sisters, the Black angry woman syndrome or stereotype. And that's some of what you got, Tawana, as well, those comments. What did you do? And so you're an angry Black woman, and so you must deserve this. You should have kept your mouth shut. You shouldn't have provoked him. And so all of those biases that are out there, we have to make sure that we dispel the myth. And then the flip side of that is the angry Black man who is an animal and barbaric and aggressive. And so you must have done that. And if you didn't do it, you've done it before. So I'm getting you for what you've done in the past, even if you didn't do it this time. And so no, the system isn't perfect, but we have to work together as faith leaders, as advocates, as partners to make sure that we bring about reform. And I always remind law enforcement, and we have more good law enforcement than bad. And that's why I work in partnership with them as a chaplain. But I still remind them that your duty is to protect and serve. And so we have to let them know every now and then, over and over, that your duty is to protect us and to serve us.
Yep, so well said. And thinking about systems, one of the biggest challenges for faith leaders is when they are faced with the whole family system. We have one more clip to show, and you'll just listen for those themes. In this clip, it's just 3 minutes long. It's from episode 2. Episode 2 has the theme of spiritual care for survivors, tools, and resources, in which our very own Reverend Tawana Davis talks with Chaplain Jenny Wachowski Estes, who's the chaplain from the Tulsa Family Safety Center. So,
what's your experience with family on this journey?
Oh, I think I'm all about healing cycles of generational trauma, you know, that every new generation has an opportunity to heal from all of the things in the past. I mean, it's hard. It's hard. When I think about family, how difficult it is to navigate like when an abuser has been allowed to be part of a family system for a long time. The first people who decide that they don't like that system are the ones who get the blame for doing a bad thing. Calling out abuse is often used as a justification to alienate survivors because they're disrupting this system that has been functioning for years. And how dare you pull out one little Jenga block, because the whole thing is just going to fall apart.
If people have this false narrative believing that the system is working because they don't talk about it, people are dying because of it. I think it's, I know, Audre Lorde says, your silence will not protect you.
Right.
And in some cases, it will. Because if I don't speak up and out, then I won't get the adverse forces coming at me saying that I'm wrong and why am I doing this and why am I the disruptor. And so sometimes my silence will protect me, but it's not a divine protection. It's not a good protection. It's not a transforming protection. It's not like it's protecting me from a perpetrator or an abuser.
I think that abuse is so normalized in in family systems. And yeah, just that's what makes it so insidious. And that is what makes it last in faith communities too, especially if you've got generations of a family in a church community. I mean, oh my gosh.
And in the essence of time, I mean, we touched on a lot of family systems and challenges and complexities for faith leaders. Definitely appreciate your deep thought and your transparency in telling your stories. We are reminded that we are dealing with, as we are dealing with faith communities and family systems, we are dealing with the LGBTQ plus community. We are dealing still with the coronavirus and isolation and the increase in domestic violence incidences that we don't know about because they are going unreported, because we're still not seeing people face to face. And, sacred texts that are the twisted scriptures, as Reverend Carey talks about. We've touched on all of that. And I think what Jenny brought to the table was really highlighting the systems piece of this. When I tell my story of domestic violence, before I came out publicly about 2 years later, I had to talk with my children first because it's their story as well, and kind of get their buy-in and their support before I told my story. So these are important pieces that we have lifted up throughout this sacred moment, that this is challenging, but we said that in the beginning as a disclaimer, it's challenging work, but it's a work that we must do. So Reverend Katie.
Yeah. And just to say again, we can't possibly contain everything in this 75 minutes. Want to uplift a couple things. Just want to remind everyone listening that you truly, none of us are alone in this. These can be lonely, confusing situations for care providers, for leaders, for recipients of the violence, even for those coming to terms with how they have been perpetuating violence. We are not alone, and we are not without resources on this. So 3 things to mention. 1, we didn't get a chance to do a screen share and all that. We're not going to do that, but there's an entire written guide with written reflections. It comes with every episode, with Boku tools for faith leaders and how to think through your network, etc. Also, there's a discount that will be plopped in the chat right now, a code that you can pass to you or to colleagues. That'll be good through July 15th for 50% off the series. And then coming up right here will be a brief poll. Before we ask, just for final comments, we want to invite everybody to participate in this poll. This is anonymous, and it just helps us enormously in better supporting those who are faith leaders and are looking to support this work. It's a huge help to us. So last things, just a quick word of hope, I think, like from all of us. Like what brings you hope? Real quick, what's giving you hope in this moment about this enormous crisis? And I'll just go on my screen to Jan, I see first.
Absolutely. At the beginning of this training, we paid tribute to the Native American indigenous people of the United States. And I have heard and have kept near my heart a saying of the Cheyenne Plains Indians. It said, a nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground, no matter how strong their weapons or how brave their warriors. And I want you to know that everyone involved here today is helping to lift up the hearts of women off the ground. We all have the opportunity. We all have the obligation, and I'm honored to be a part of this today. You all give me hope.
And Denise.
I think for us, we have a beautiful verse that describes what marriage is in the Quran. And the idea is that we are born from one soul and we are brought together to create peace. That's our definition of what marriage is supposed to be, what partnership is supposed to be. So in the end of the day, I go to my faith for hope. I know that no matter how many people have twisted and turned and put upside down the scripture, that my God had as his intention for us to join in partnership to create peace.
For me, what gives me hope is to see town halls like this and the education and the collaboration and the partnerships. Everyone deserves to be in a safe relationship. And town halls like this, partnerships like this, collaborations like this give me hope that we are helping people to be in a relationship that is safe. And so my faith teaches me that we are to love each other as Christ loved the church and sacrificed, gave for the church. And so in relationships, I asked the partners in the relationship, are you loving that way? Make sure that you try to out-compete, out-love each other, not abuse each other, but out-love each other. And if we get more people to out-love each other by giving and serving, then the world would be in a better place.
I love that. And I'm just going to say my word of hope.
Yeah,
I know, right? And all the people said. And before, but I want to embarrass Reverend Tawana just a little bit by saying, like, this moment gives me hope, but also just walking alongside colleagues like Reverend Tawana Davis, who has really just put her story out there in such a huge way. And I just continue to learn from her all the time. So that, Tawana, I'm just going to embarrass you that way and hand you the last word.
St. Augustine says, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage, anger at the way things are and the courage to ensure they don't remain that way. So when we use words like anger, it's putting it in that spiritual context where it is a feeling, and it's a feeling to teach us to move differently, to move in hope, to move in love, to move away from that anger that becomes layers of trauma and becomes disruptive. And then the courage to have faith, the courage to love beyond measure, the courage to do what Carrie just said, just to compete in that loving each other. So if we can just, that's what gives me hope, remembering that idea and that definition from St. Augustine about having two beautiful daughters, anger and courage, and to make sure things don't remain this way. And it's because of your courage and because of your, frustration with the system and what's happening that you're here, that we are able to bring hope to so many people. And I'm so grateful.
Thank you. With a word of just hope and thanksgiving, and all the sense of connectedness and strength. May we go out love each other. Bye, everyone.